Hello again everyone, and welcome back. Some time ago I did this Sweet Tooth van from the game Twisted Metal. That video was well received, and several of you asked me to try to take on Sweetbot. At the time I didn't know if that would be very easy to do. Figures need articulation to look right, and scratch building them can be difficult, though certainly not impossible. I kept the idea in the back of my head, and then one day came across this broken Transformer toy at a garage sale. Looking at it, I could see a bunch of parts that might be close to the 1/64 scale I was needing. I went ahead and got it for $1, and then took it home and started measuring and testing for fit and scale. And to my surprise, a lot of the parts seemed to match up, and the idea seemed doable. So I figured I'd give it a go because if I could get it to work, it would save me a lot of effort and I could steal the articulation from the toy. So what you'll see here is a lot of trial and error, but in the end, a pretty cool figure in my opinion. I should note that my only experience in this area is in creating Star Wars zombie troopers. This is the first figure I've ever built from the ground up, if you don't count the mech I built a few years back. Anyway, let's get started. So the first thing I did was take the toy apart by removing the lower half of the legs and the upper torso and arms. These were all kept in place with small screws. The hips and upper legs are what I'm primarily going for. On this toy they're very small compared to the rest of the body, and checking them against the combat medic, I'm certain they'll fit fine. So I'll go ahead and cut off the upper part, leaving 2 posts that I'll need to attach to the van later. After taking the legs apart, I noticed that each foot was one unit and articulated. I decided to incorporate the feet and ankles into the figure despite not being correct to the game character. I have a few reasons for doing this. 1, the feet are ready to go. 2, they add a lot of extra height, and I feel I'll need that in the final character. And 3, I like figures that are stable when standing, and these feet will allow him to stand without falling over if I put his arms straight out. To attach them to the legs, I'll be using a barrel sander on the Dremel to sand open the bottom ring that was originally the knee, and then glue on the feet with super glue. Now it's probably a good time to state that I'll be using some creative license on this figure. Getting an exact match with what is essentially kit bashing is not as possible as scratch building, and scratch building for me would be 98% 3D printing, which a lot of you have commented you don't like because not everyone has a 3D printer at home. That being said, there are still some parts that I'll make using 3D printing here, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. So let's move over to the van. As mentioned before, I'll be using a combat medic. Mattel makes an ice cream van, but it suffers from an overuse of plastic. This combat medic is still mostly die cast. Also, it's a bit larger than the ice cream truck, and I'll need that space to attach the other body parts. So the first thing I'll do is mount the van in a vise and carefully cut it in half with a hacksaw. I'll have to do this twice because I'll also need the back part of the van, which I'll need to add on later. I decided to do the cut at a slight diagonal just for aesthetics. Next, I'll start filing in 2 notches with a small file. These notches will be where the arms will mount onto the van. The arms have a ring on them just like the knee and allow the shoulders to rotate away from the body. This is not necessary for this figure, however I will need to keep the rotation in this joint for the arms to move front to back. So I'll also do a little bit of filing on the plastic to allow the rings to fit into the little notches I'm filing into the van body. This is sort of just a back and forth where I file a little bit on each part until they fit together. I also went ahead and filed in 2 notches in the plastic base to allow for the 2 posts on the lower torso. You can see here how it all goes together. At this point nothing is glued on, it's just held together by gravity and compression fits. Next I'm going to remove the arm cannons. I won't be needing these in my figure. These turned out to be a real pain to remove as it seems that they are either sonic welded or glued together, but with some persistence I did finally get them off. After I remove them, I'll use the barrel sander again to sand the ring off the right arm. I left the ring on the left arm for now. I'll be using this later in the build. These Transformer toys have a bunch of screws holding them together, and I want to hide them along with the holes. To do this, I plan to just fill them in with some putty and then sand them flush. This worked, but it was very time consuming and the putty had trouble drying. The top of the hole would dry, sealing in the putty below and not allowing it to dry. I would come along hours later and start sanding only to find wet putty below. You can buy 2-part putties that you take equal parts of and then knead them together. These putties are not air dried and thus you don't have to worry about them sealing up on you. These would have been a much better option here, but eventually I was able to get them all filled and sanded with the air-dried putty. So plastic is notoriously difficult to paint. This has to do with it not having much for the paint to grab a hold of. To allow for good paint adhesion, it's always best to go over the plastic with some kind of abrasive to really rough up the surface. Here I chose to go with some triple-aught steel wool, but Scotch-Brite pads also work really well for this. After I'm done preparing the surface, I will clean all the parts with a slightly damp paper towel and then paint them with a surface primer intended to be used on plastic. So behind the scenes I have my 3D printer creating some of the parts I'll be needing later. All these parts are from my previous video on the Sweet Tooth van, so if you'd like to know more about them, please see that video. The only real change I made was creating his hair. Some people liked my hot glue hair in that video, and a bunch of you did not. So I decided to just create and print the hair this time. You may also notice that the parts are a bit yellow. You have to cure the resin in UV light, and the fastest way of doing this is just to set them in the sun. However, if you do this, they take on a yellow color. Not important here as I plan to paint them, but if you don't want this yellow color, then you'll need to purchase a UV curing box to place them in. This will cure the parts without changing their color. The spike guards need to be mounted on the shoulders. I just printed the ones I built for the van unmodified. So I need to sand these down to fit using the barrel sander. Make sure when you sand resin that you're doing so outside and with a mask on. We all have plenty of masks hanging around at this point, so no excuses. The resin dust is toxic and not something you want to breathe. Here again, this was just a back and forth process. I sand for a little bit, then I test the fit. Once they are where I wanted them to be, I glue them on with a little bit of super glue. Alright, so moving back to the van, you can see here that I've gone ahead and removed the paint with some paint stripper. After that, I painted the body with some of the white primer just like I did with the plastic parts. I want to make this figure match up to the van I built before, as I plan to have them on display with each other. So I'll mask off the top of the van and paint the bottom teal just like I did the other van. After this, I'll also paint the feet and arms this same teal blue. Now I'm not putting a ton of effort into the painting of these plastic parts as there will be many layers going on top, so odds are you'll only see hints of this blue in the final look. Next, using a hole punch, I'll punch out some holes in some painter's tape and then start applying them to the figure. These will be red polka dots just like in the other van. Here again, they won't be very noticeable in the final look unless you're looking very carefully. After they dry, I can remove the tape. Since I have the airbrush out, I'll go ahead and paint these shoulder spikes with a rust colored primer, and then set everything aside for a few hours to dry. Now comes one of the more enjoyable parts for me, adding on the wash. Here I'm using my normal non-oil wash by Citadel. You just paint it all over the parts and then set them aside to dry. The wash will seep into all the panel lines, cracks, and crevices, where it will then dry darker than the raised surfaces. This gives a lot of dimension and grime to the look of your figure. Once it's all dried, you can go over the parts with a paper towel lightly soaked in some isopropyl alcohol to remove some of the wash on the raised surfaces, leaving it in the valleys. After this is dried, I spray all the parts with some Tester's matte clear coat to set the wash and the underlying layers. After the clear coat has dried, I'll go ahead and put the van, well, at least the front of the van, back together. Once this is done, I can go about gluing on the lower torso with some super glue. It would have been cool to have some articulation for the waist, but I didn't feel that there was any easy way to achieve this, and I worried that if I removed the two posts, which I would have to do if I wanted him to turn at the waist, if I removed them it would weaken the figure at this point and could potentially break. So I decided to forego the articulation for the added stability. After the glue dried for the lower torso, I went about gluing in the arms. Here I had to be very careful not to get any glue in the joints, so I glued these off camera and kept a close eye on them. For his back, I plan to use the back of the van. I'm aware that the game character has jets on his back that allow him to fly. I played around with this idea for a while and made a small jetpack. However, I decided to just go with the back of the van with the doors instead. I made this decision because if I put on the jetpack, his side profile started to look strange. The van sticking out the front and the jetpack sticking out the back. Also, the jetpack would interfere with the arm's articulation due to the spikes. Right now I can raise his arms all the way up, but if I put on the jetpack I barely get his arms straight out. So these two issues made me nix the jetpack for now and just go with the back of the van. Later I may rebuild me a new jetpack that will just stick on the back of the van. Now I'm going to start working on his head. The first thing I want to do is find a fairly large piece of tubing to attach the head to and will represent his neck. I thought about a spring, but given the scale I'm working at, I didn't think that the space between the van and the bottom of his head would be enough to go through the trouble of using a spring. Plus I'm hoping to be able to turn his head, and that would be difficult with a spring. Anyway, before I cut the pipe, I decided to use it as a holder to help me paint the head. Speaking of paint, I first painted on 2 coats of the white primer and then started airbrushing on yellow to his hair. After the yellow dried, I moved to the red and started blending the red onto the yellow, starting from the tips of the hair and moving forward. This allowed me to get an orange color in the middle and a fiery red on the tips. While I had the red out, I painted on his nose with a small brush, and I also applied some to his cheeks and in his eyes. After this all dried, I sprayed the head with some Tesser's clear coat and then applied the Nuln Oil wash as before. After this dried, I reapplied the clear coat to set all the color and the wash. Now that I'm done with the pipe as a handle, I can cut off a small section and glue it to the top of the van where I want the head to be. The head itself is just pressed onto the pipe and held in place through a compression fit. So this next step is pretty important. What I'm doing here is spraying on a burnt umber ink wash. This is a blending step that I use to tie in all of the parts that I've painted separately together. It's sort of a uniform color that goes over everything and makes everything look like it should be there. Here I'm using it as a thin layer of dirt and grime. If you did not do this step, then there's a chance that one arm or leg will be cleaner than the other and thus look out of place. Any project like this where you have a bunch of parts painted separately will need this sort of step to bring everything together. After the ink dries, I can start putting in the damage and bringing out the metallic nature of my robot. Now this is going to seem backwards, but what I want is to show the metal under all the paint. There are several ways of doing this. The most common is by creating a chipping layer that allows paint to be removed and exposing the metal under it. That works well for rusty layers, but not well at all if you want to show a shiny metal layer. So to get this effect, I'll apply the metal on top in a way that tricks your brain into thinking it's the metal under the paint. To do this, I'll be using some rub and buff and 2 popsicle sticks. I'll apply some of the rub and buff to one of the sticks and then smear it with the other stick to create a thin layer on the flat stick. Then using the flat side of the stick, I'll go over the areas I want exposed shiny metal. You only want to use the stick to apply the product. Brushes will not give the same effect. I then wait 10 minutes for the product to fully dry. And this is extremely important. You have to wait the 10 minutes because if you get into a hurry, the wet rub and buff will smear all over your work, metallizing it. So be sure you wait that 10 minutes. The buffing can be done with a simple paper towel. I like to use the blue ones mechanics use because they're a little bit softer. Simply go over the rub and buff and it will shine right up. Change the paper towel as often as you can. Again, you don't want to drag the product over areas you don't want shiny. Areas like his hands and feet I applied more than areas that would not see as much wear and tear, like his upper arms. Unfortunately, my video setup is done in a way to combat glare, so the rub and buff is much brighter in person than what we get here. But hopefully you can see all the metallic scuffs and wear I was able to achieve using this technique. I should note that you cannot really cover the rub and buff with any clear coat without dulling it. However, I also find that it's not necessary to cover it. Once it fully dries, it stays shiny and doesn't wipe off. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is add on his main gun to his left arm. I think he has it on his right arm in the game, so an oversight on my part. You can put it on the correct arm when you build yours. The gun needs to be metallized, and since I want it to match the rest of my work, I'll just go over it with the rub and buff. Here, however, I'll use a brush to apply it as it allows me to get into the nooks and corners. Once it's dry, I buff it just as before, and then I can glue it onto the half ring I left on his left arm. Sweetbot also has 2 miniguns mounted to the front of the van. Both of these were done the exact same way as before. Alright, we finally made it to the last step. Here again, I'll go over the figure with black acrylic primer, going over the guns and blending them in, and also going over exposed joints, making burn marks, painting his neck, little things here and there. After this, the bot is done. And here he is, the completed SweetBot. Now before you ask, I have no clue how all this would fit inside that van. SweetBot was supposedly a tribute to Transformers, and the Transformers concept of physics and scale was way down the list of important things to get right in each show. But what I did end up with is a bot definitely in the spirit of SweetBot, and well, it looks really cool next to my SweetBot van. This is a figure that was never made and sold to the public, but if it had, I think it would have been relatively popular. If I had any complaints, it would be that the blue paint and red polka dots got a little buried under all the other layers, and the only way you can see them is to look very closely. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with this one, especially being my first custom figure to bring to life. I think his proportions came out right, or at least the way that they do in the actual figure. His gun may be a bit too big, but that's easy to change, and I built several in different sizes in case I didn't like this one. Of course, I look forward to your thoughts down in the comments. This is usually where I find out where I messed up and where I really messed up, and sometimes how I got things right. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.